Good morning, Anchorage, Alaska, the lower 48, and the rest of the world. It's Bruce Lindquist with his podcast, Wonderful Counselor. If you've been listening to the previous podcast episode, The Package, you were left hanging with a life or death ethical dilemma. If you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to do so you'll have some character and plot context. Now, before we begin, I would once again like to thank our sponsor, Coffee House Theater. You've been with me since the beginning, and your support is appreciated. Now, I also want to give just a brief warning about this podcast. This particular episode would probably be for maybe later teens and definitely adults. So now time for our second episode, titled The Crimson Tide. Meg had a washed look of relief on her face as Jack watched her wave goodbye through the rearview mirror as he and Cathy drove off to the sound of gravel like artillery hitting the truck's undercarriage as they headed down the steep incline of what in many parts of Alaska is a driveway. The view would have been staggeringly beautiful. Bear Valley wasn't your typical valley, though, laced with green lush canopies and a flowing river. No, this valley was in the mountains, made from glaciers, traversing, ripping up rocks through the centuries like deep scraping of a sharp, slow-moving blade. And if you listened close enough, you could hear the ground cry for mercy, but none came. Majestic views would take one's breath away, looking down on Turnagain Arm and Cook Inlet with white snow-capped mountains as a halo in the background. But the darkness of the hour, it was like death's black veil that smothered the sleeping beauty. The headlights of the truck cut through the night, creating shadowy like creatures, reflecting off the gloom of the now ascending fog lifting from the ground. Jack focused on driving down Clark's Road, and Cathy sat next to him, quivering, as if jolted by electricity, as the last 24 hours had shaken her to the core. Cathy was not an anxious person by nature, but she was so emotionally heightened, it was like her soul was laid bare by one decision. And now to be exposed, the very intent of her heart naked before her? She was desperately looking for some clothes of justification so she could live with what she had done. Jack, too, was down to bare wire only. What was pulsing through his body wasn't anxiety. It was numbness, an almost death-like state that masked the horror of what he left Cathy to decide. Jack had taken many bullets to protect those he served in his 30-year career with APD, the Anchorage Police Force Homicide Division, and he would have taken another bullet for his dear friend Cathy, but in this case she had the gun, well, rather the needle, in her hand, and he couldn't shelter her from that. It seemed like eternity before Cathy dared to whisper the words, "He made us play God," and her voice sounded like it was haunting her from another world as those words hung in the air like sacrilege. She continued, "We stole her real life from her. She will never know who she really was or what happened to her." Jack listened desperately, trying not to trample over her words with his. He paused and spoke, matching her whisper. "Yes, we played God," said Jack, "and you chose to save her life rather than her knowing the truth." "I just couldn't bear her screaming again," said Cathy, "and letting that volcano relive the torture he put her through. He wanted us to give her that injection so she would remember and experience her eruption. I couldn't let that happen. Oh, Jack, what have I done?" "Listen to me, Cathy," said Jack. "You let her keep her false life, and she will not know the torture that sadistic monster put her through. Many years ago, you saw her clothes. You examined the body fluid on them. You listened to the heart doctor tonight. You know the drug would have caused her memories to flood and to drown her in a sea of pain. She probably wouldn't have survived." "But what if I was wrong?" cried Cathy. "What if she would have survived? and the volcano got what he wanted, but she lived. What if she wanted me to take the risk? What if I get to heaven and God says I screwed up, and I face her and I have to answer for my decision, and she wanted to be who she was created to be? God knows, said Jack, you did your best. Remember, in heaven, there's far more mercy than you're giving yourself right now. Jack pulled into Cathy's driveway, and she saw from her security door camera earlier another package sitting on the porch. Jack picked it up and they both went inside. Would you like some tea? Asked Cathy, and Jack nodded as they both sat at the table, sipping their hot beverages, looking at the package. It's been a long night. Cathy was exhausted, but too tired to sleep. Jack sensed his presence was needed and held her shaking body until she finally fell asleep in his arms. Cathy awoke to the sun shining through the window. The temp outside was now in the 50s. Cathy felt safe, snuggled in Jack's arms, and she slowly rolled him over and got up and surprised him with breakfast. Jack looked at the package as an afterthought as Cathy took his breath away. She was so beautiful, and her late husband was indeed a lucky man. Cathy made a Spanish omelet with her homemade salsa. Jack said grace, and both enjoyed his and her 7-egg omelets, complete with sautéed caramelized onions, reindeer sausage, and fresh bread from Fire Island Bakery with Alaska winter bee honey. Jack helped clean up the kitchen, and they both just stared at the package. Jack broke the brief silence and said, well, the last package led us to hell and back. Where do you suppose this one will take us? Only one way to find out, said Cathy. And once again the gloves were on, and the first layer of paper was placed in the evidence bin, like the last package had been. The package was strangled with rope, and it was like it started to breathe again when her blade severed the cord. Cathy was not surprised to see the postcard sitting on top of the package, only this one didn't say welcome to the Bahamas or to Anchorage, as before. No, it said welcome to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and the number 18 was written on it in red ink signed the Volcano God. Jack recognized the postcard. It was from a package received by his younger brother, who worked on the Alabama State Police Force over 30 years ago. Cathy placed the card in the evidence bin. She then slit the throat of the package open and peered inside. Jack pulled out a signature white pom-pom that was a crimson tide cheerleaders would use. At the bottom of the box was a card that simply said in red ink, "This one you will make scream. Time to go back to college," and the number 115 was stamped on it. Well, it looks like we're going to get your spring now, said Jack. Yeah, but a lot of humidity, said Cathy. She booked the plane, but unfortunately there were no direct flights to Birmingham, Alabama. So it's going to be a milk trip. But that's how it'll be okay. We're retired. We're leaving tomorrow morning, said Cathy. Jack asked why the delay, and she shared, don't you want to know where both of the packages came from? Jack agreed to the plan, and soon they were standing at an old warehouse that matched the shipping number on the package. Cathy rang the bell of the building, and an older man, by the looks of him who was about to retire, opened the door. He introduced himself as George Hadelson. Cathy went through the usual pleasantries with him and showed him the package number and acted as if she was going to return it and wanted to know who sent it. George said it's the strangest thing he's ever been asked to do. It's been 30 years ago, actually to the date today, when a man came bringing 2 packages, and he was to wait until a specific year and day and time to have them delivered. At first I declined. I prided myself in getting mail delivered on time. Then this guy said that he'd make it all worth my while, as he knows I have dental bills and my insurance wasn't covering all of them. He said he would pay the bill if I agreed to his instructions. Cathy asked what the man looked like. George paused. He said that was quite a while ago, and my body may be failing, but I still have a photographic memory. George continued. He looked professional, well-dressed, well-groomed, had a very pleasant voice, although I couldn't tell what part of the country he was from. Why was that? Asked Cathy. Well, George said, I'm just guessing, but when you've been in a place for a while and the accent of the people rubs off on you, well, this guy's been in a lot of places. Anything else? Asked Jack. Well, said George, his hair was blonde, he had blue eyes, average height and weight. Nothing striking about him except his ring. What about his ring? Asked Cathy. George said, it was black, with blood red colored V engraved on it. I've never seen anything like it. I remember asking him about it, since it's left such an impression and all, and then he said something that seemed quite strange given his persona. He looked at me nonchalantly, and then his blue eyes turned piercing, and he said, that's how I leave my mark on the world. I was curious, so I asked him how he does that, and he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that was kind, more of a questioning smile like, are you sure you want to find out? I remember it startled me, and I ended the conversation and agreed to follow his instructions. How old did he look? Asked Jack. Well, probably in his mid to late 20s, answered George. How'd he pay for it? Asked Cathy. He paid cash, and enough to pay the bill for my compliance for all these years. George became quite concerned and asked them, you're not going to say anything to the company? I'm close to retiring. Cathy said, no, it'll be our little secret. Cathy looked at Jack as they were leaving and sighed. 30 years in the making, and he's still playing us. We could quit the game, said Jack, but then he answered his own response. If we don't follow his instructions, we won't find the missing cheerleader. By the time all the layovers had taken place and their flight landed in Birmingham, Alabama, they were exhausted. Fortunately for them, Jack's younger brother of 10 years named John met them at the airport, so they didn't have to stay in a hotel, but instead he welcomed them into their home in Northport, Alabama. Now, John's wife's name was Christy, a Southern belle if there ever was one, and while John was a boisterous Southern boy, she was more than his equal. She wasn't a trophy wife. She could hold her own to anyone who dared to traditionally put her in her supposed place. When the girls caught up on each other's doings over the years, Jack and his brother had a much different conversation. John looked at his brother and said, hey, let's go fishing like we did in old times, with the lake bass and waiting. We could go to Lake Lorraine State Park. You remember how we used to fish there? Jack was focused on the business at hand. His brother wanted this to be a social call, and Jack could do social only so long. Then he interrupted the conversation, showing John the package with the cheerleading pom-pom in it and the postcard. John sat back in his chair. Memories filled his mind of meeting the frantic family of Susan Chambers after their daughter was missing. Then, a few days later, she just mysteriously showed up. Seemed no worse than where, but then that night she died of a heart attack. I know that volcano got his start in Alaska, said John. Probably somehow contributed to that woman's death. Well, I don't understand why he's sending you here, brother. She's dead and buried. Unbeknownst to John, both Cathy and Christy were listening in. Well, said Cathy, it doesn't make sense that the volcano would send us here to visit a dead body, but while we're in the area. Jack asked his brother if he could give him access to the box of evidence of what he had on Susan, and John agreed to call in some favors and would do all that he could to help him. The next morning, among drenching humidity and a cascade of flying perpetrator-like bugs that bit first and asked questions later, they made their way to the Tuscaloosa police station. The officers heard legends about both of them from their dads and were more than willing to give them the box. Jack put on his evidence gloves. John said, you're wasting your time. That was 30 years ago. Your fingerprints aren't going to matter. Humor me, said Jack. So John acquiesced. Jack pulled out a red cheerleading red and white uniform top and another pom-pom out of the box. There's nothing else here, said John. Does she have any living relatives? Asked Jack. Yeah, she's got a sister, about the same age. She lives in the area. Jack called Cathy, and she and Christy agreed to meet them there. Margaret Chambers answered the door. She was in her mid-late 50s, a frail-looking blonde-haired woman who looked like she hadn't seen a hamburger in a very long time. Since it was a small town, she recognized John and Christy, and Jack introduced himself to Cathy and himself. The house was charming yet unnerving at the same time. All over the home were pictures of Susan, and since Margaret doesn't have a lot of visitors, they got to tour complete with seeing Susan's bedroom, and it was like time stood still, that she could walk in the door at any moment. "Haven't changed a thing," said Margaret. "It was like my life stopped when she died." Jack explained why they were there and showed her the pom-pom. Margaret did something no one thought to do. She reached in the pom-pom and pulled out a hidden seam, and there were the initials SC. "We all marked our pom-poms because they looked alike. So whoever sent this to you is a very sick person. It belonged to my sister." John called the station, and the officer checked the pom-pom. And the initials SC were on it as well. Cathy showed Margaret a piece of paper with the number 115 on it and asked if it meant anything to her. Margaret grabbed her coat, got into her car, and all of them followed her to the University of Alabama college campus. They entered Bryant-Denny Stadium to a specific suite where there were changing rooms for the cheerleaders during the biggest games of the year. "The night that Susan disappeared," said Margaret, "was the biggest game, Iron Bowl. It was November when the Crimson Tide played the Auburn Tigers. It's hard to believe that was 30 years ago." Margaret led them to locker 115. "This was Susan's locker the night of the game. And my parents, when they were alive, they donated a lot of money to the university. And when they requested this locker be sealed and made a memorial for their daughter, the faculty agreed. Plus everyone loved Susan. Who didn't?" Just like Margaret's house, this locker looked like a relic of the past, complete with a padlock. "When's the last time this was open?" asked Jack. And Margaret chimed back, 30 years ago. "Do you know the combination?" asked Cathy, and Margaret reluctantly opened the locker. "What I need you to do is to look through this locker and see if there's something out of place, or something that just shouldn't be there," instructed Jack. Margaret went through the pictures, lipstick, list of boyfriends, feminine products, soaps, lotions, and shampoos. Margaret said, "Nothing out of the ordinary," and was about to close the locker when she said, "Wait a minute, what's this?" And she pulled out a piece of paper with tissue paper that was against the locker wall. It seemingly was meticulously placed there, and when she did, a brown small bit of paper fell to the floor. Margaret picked it up, and written in red ink was the number 18, and Cathy's blood went cold. Margaret secured the locker, and they all returned to her home. Margaret asked, "What's the writing mean?" Cathy said it was an invitation from the volcano to go to Susan's grave. They followed Margaret to the cemetery, and she led them there. Cathy asked Margaret if her sister died. There was an autopsy performed. And Margaret said there wasn't. Her parents accepted she had a heart attack, and they buried her quickly. They couldn't bear her daughter being cut up, so they just had buried her in her cheerleading outfit, not even any fluids drained. Cathy asked if it was an open or closed coffin funeral, and Margaret shared, "It is closed. She threw flowers in the coffin as it was lowered to the ground after the Catholic priest finished the funeral service." Margaret said, "We had a brief meal at the folks' house, talked with Susan. Throughout the rest of the night, there were a lot talked about Susan through the rest of the night. There were a lot of memories to cover. There was also a lot of alcohol. I got quite tipsy that night." "Thank you for bringing us here," said Cathy, and they all paid their respects and left, and then dropped Margaret back home. When they got back to John and Christie's, which was their base camp, there was a letter addressed to John's brother. They had won an all-expense cruise to the Caribbean, and according to the contest rules, they had to leave this week. "Wow," said John. "I never won anything in my entire life. I remember putting this online, but didn't dream we'd win." Jack and Cathy congratulated them on their good fortune. John said, "You're welcome to stay at our place. Plenty of food in the refrigerator. You're all set for at least a few weeks. Plus, you can use our vehicles if you need to." Both agreed. "In that case," John said, "we're flying out tomorrow then. We'll be back before the food runs out." And just like that, before they knew it, they both were gone. Cathy and Jack sat down and enjoyed some sweet tea. Since the house was air-conditioned, it was quite pleasant until they went outside. "Something doesn't add up," said Cathy. "The volcano kidnaps and tortures the women. He doesn't kill them. I sure would like to get a good look inside that grave." "Well, we're too old to be grave diggers off some B-rated horror movie digging up the dead," mused Jack. Cathy shared. She planned to take a brief nap and then prepare some dinner. Jack turned off the computer and said he needed to go into town, but he'd be back soon. Jack was gone only a few hours, but returned in time for dinner and did dishes afterwards and joined her on the couch. Cathy, sitting next to Jack, after she realized she was dozing off, indicated she was headed to bed. Jack looked at her mischievously and said, "Let's go for a ride first." Cathy, after about 30-minute drive, asked where they were going, and Jack said, "You'll see," and they turned off the main road and, to Cathy's surprise, pulled into the cemetery. Jack got out and opened the truck. "What you got in there?" yelled Cathy. "A couple shovels? Thought we were not going to be grave robbers." Jack hauled out a lot of equipment, and they both walked over to Susan's gravestone. Jack said he went to the commercial and industrial equipment stores. "I could have rented this, but if it works, I'm shipping it all the way back to Alaska." Cathy asked, "How do you see in a coffin that's 6 feet underground without digging it up?" "Well," said Jack, pulling out an industrial T-handle soil core probe, "like this," and he shoved the bottom of the T in the ground, watching the feet indicator until it reached almost 6 feet, then slowly until it struck something other than dirt. He then, with a slide hammer, drove with a weighted mallet a steel shaft into the ground at the same depth. He then inserted an electric auger that hollowed out the channel made by the tube, which slowly made its way down until it felt it hit something solid. He then bored a small hole in the wood of the coffin, and the metal sleeve slid through inside the steel pipe past the breach in the wood and formed a guide channel. He then set up and calibrated the optics of the borescope, and using the joystick to control it, worked the flexible probe cable down through the wooden breach with a microscopic hole, and the camera will fit right through it. He turned on the light in the scope camera and saw on the monitor there were no bones in the coffin. It was essentially empty. Jack worked the camera in different directions and saw at the far right-hand corner a shiny object, and also what looked like 2 pom-poms. He used the camera magnification and took a picture of the objects, and then pulled out the flexible scope and sleeve and auger and then the pipe. Cathy couldn't believe what she just saw Jack accomplish and was amazed, and then she asked, "What were the objects?" Jack confirmed it was indeed a shiny pin. The logo said AU. It was Auburn Tiger College sports pin, and the pom-poms, the colors were orange and one was blue. The irony was unmistakable. In the cheerleader of a Crimson Tide coffin was their arch rival, the Auburn Tiger pin and matching cheerleader pom-poms. On the pin were the initials SC. Cathy said, "The volcano didn't kill her. He kidnapped her again, leaving everyone to believe she was dead and buried." "How could he have done that?" asked Jack. Cathy got in the driver's seat and said, "It's my turn," and took off down the road. "Where are we going?" asked Jack. Cathy enjoyed how the tables had turned and said, "You'll see," and they drove to Margaret's house. Cathy was on a mission. She knocked on the door, and Margaret welcomed them both inside. Cathy said, "I hate to bother you at this late of an hour, but you wouldn't happen to have your sister's death certificate by any chance?" "Of course I do," said Margaret. "I brought the she brought the document to her. Cathy looked at the coroner's signature and the signature underneath. She wasn't used to seeing a second signature. It read Brian Mills, M.D. "Do you know this doctor?" asked Cathy. "Sure," said Margaret. "He's a friend of the family." And showed her a picture of him at the Alabama and Auburn football game 30 years ago, the same night that Susan had disappeared. Cathy looked at the photograph. He looked just like the man George had described. Margaret asked, "What's this all about?" Cathy shared with her that her sister's coffin is empty, except for an AU pin and 2 Auburn cheerleading pom-poms. They suspect that Brian Mills is the volcano, and he must have given Susan a drug to make it look like she had a heart attack, and then kidnapped her for the second and final time. Margaret looked like someone hit her with a wrecking ball. She then asked in a state of shock, "If my sister was not in the coffin, where is she buried?" Jack said, "I don't want to get your hopes up, but the volcano doesn't kill, so there's a chance your sister's still alive." "Well, if that's true, I must find her," said Margaret. "You got to help me find her." Jack paused and then said, "It looks like we're looking in the wrong city and the wrong college campus." Cathy asked Margaret if she was up for a ride to Auburn, and she nodded. And 3 hours later, all of them were there. "Well, somewhere in this city, Margaret, your sister could be alive," said Cathy. Margaret thought a moment and said, "She would have started her 3rd year in college. This is crazy. But my sister is still alive? What if he damaged her brain and she changed her appearances somehow and became a cheerleader for Auburn against us?" "Well, let's see if we can find a CS that was an Auburn cheerleader," said Cathy. Now, to say Margaret talking to older Auburn cheerleaders would have been over my dead body moment, but she let her school rivalry go and focused on at least they were from Alabama. And it wasn't their fault they were Tigers. She blamed that on their parents. Margaret knew one of the cheerleaders was still around. She'd heard rumors. So they went to the home of Jill Sands, who was a cheerleader from 30 years ago. Jill was quite friendly and invited them in. She jokingly said, "I'm going to invite you here. God'll forgive 'em for being Crimson Tide and not seeing the light being an Auburn Tiger." Cathy asked her to think back if a new cheerleader joined them around the time of Margaret's sister Susan's disappearance that had the same initials. Jill thought for a moment and said, "My best friend in the world fits that description. Her name's Stephanie Cross. She looks like she came out of nowhere, and she blew away at the tryouts." "Where does she live?" asked Margaret. Jill said, "Just down the road. It's still early. We can go visit her." Stephanie answered the door. She lived by herself now that her husband of 25 years was deceased. They did not have any children. Cathy couldn't believe her eyes. Stephanie looked just like the picture of Susan, except her hair wasn't blonde. She had short black hair. Stephanie just stared at her and said, "Y'all are either here to kill me or save me. But either way, come on in." Stephanie brought out some sweet tea. They sat down in her living room. Stephanie started crying. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's just I'm not sleeping. I get so tired all the time because I'm afraid to close my eyes." "What happens when you close your eyes?" asked Cathy, empathetically. "I become a different person. The person screams for no reason. She just screams," said Stephanie. Cathy looked at Stephanie's arm. She could see cuts, marks, and asked her about them. Cathy admitted, "Cut myself because when I pass out, after days of not sleeping, it's the only way I can wake up and open my eyes." Cathy explained they were here to help her and could restore her memory with an injection and answer the question, "Who is she?" Stephanie said, "I need to know. Give me that injection." Cathy shared, I need to give you full disclosure, what we know before I do this. Stephanie said, are you going to share with me the reason I scream in my nightmares? And Cathy said, yes. Stephanie agreed to listen to Cathy, and she heard her name is Susan Chambers. Stephanie stopped right there and said, that's the name of the woman screaming in my nightmare. Susan. Cathy continued, you were kidnapped twice by a sadistic torturer named the Volcano. And Stephanie lifted the back of her hair, and a V was branded on her skin. Cathy said, the number 18 is how long you lasted being tortured before you passed out. Given he had 2 shots at you, there will be 36 minutes of indescribable pain. If you receive the injection, you will, in his words, erupt. Cathy also explained the body fluids found in her clothes and what that meant as well, and the device next to her heart that was placed there without anesthesia. Cathy said the Volcano through that device, when he turns it on, will be able to listen to your screams. Stephanie drew back and said, I need some time. I don't know if I want to be Susan again. Stephanie continued drinking her tea, shaking, and then realized if she gets the injection, petting will not work. She'll have no safe place to open her eyes, and she'd rather experience critical nightmares than not feel safe when she woke up. Cathy not in a million years would violate her choice, but a million years can come in a second as an email arrived on her phone. It was from John and Christy, titled, Having a Great Vacation in the Bahamas, until it wasn't. It was from the Volcano. It read, I thought I would interrupt our little game and give you a choice. Give her the injection regardless of what she decides. Violate her with a... And then the camera clicked on, and John and Christy were tied to the chair. And the Volcano said, I will make John watch his wife scream as she erupts for over 51 minutes, and you will watch and listen in real time. I've placed the knife in Christy's hands. I won't touch her at first. She'll stab herself initially just below the heart to save her husband, or make my creation Stephanie return to being Susan. I want to listen to her scream and erupt. Oh, and make sure she has her knife, as she will scream louder and cut deeper when the pain doesn't make the image go away, or numb the feelings of my knife crawling up and down her skin. Christy is strong, and what I do will torment her for the rest of her life and John. But Stephanie will do to herself when her mind shatters like broken glass. It will be just a matter of time when she decides to close her eyes forever to end her nightmares. Either way, someone you know will scream, maybe to death. It's your choice, Cathy and Jack. Oh, and I know you both are recovering from the last time you played God. Now, who will you sacrifice to me? You have 5 minutes to decide. After this, I will return to the past. As you're probably aware, a 3rd package is about to arrive. So what would you do if you're Jack and Cathy? This woman you promised to honor her decision. Do you now purposely traumatize her and have her relive the most torturous 16 minutes of her life and make every nightmare sensation come true while the Volcano takes it all in as she erupts? Or do you make John watch the Volcano cause his wife Christy to erupt for 51 minutes? As before, it's time to play God. Who screams? In the words of the most dangerous serial killer in my previous podcast series, Good Old Joe, I don't kill you. I simply place you in an environment where you make the choice to die or wish you did. Hurry up and decide the next package is arriving at your door. Join me for the next Wonderful Counselor podcast episode, The Razor's Edge.